Welcome to today's A Slice of Medieval. We have a returning guest today, and I am very happy she's back because I've just finished her book and it is awesome. So today we have Sunday Times bestselling author Anne O'Brien, who was born in West Yorkshire. She lived in East Yorkshire for many years as a teacher of history, and today she lives with her husband in an 18th century timber-framed cottage in the depths of the Welsh Marches in Herefordshire. Anne's new book, A Court of Betrayal, came out earlier this year and tells the story of Roger Mortimer, lover of Isabella of France and deposer of Edward II, and his long-suffering, abandoned wife, Joan de Genville. And I think the paperback's just come out, hasn't it, Anne?
Yes, it has. 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wonderful. So welcome, Anne. And first of all, I'd like to ask you, do you call her Joan de Genville or Joanne? In the book, she's Joanne, isn't she?
Yes. Mentally, it's Joan, but I saw it spelt in a document with the H in the middle as Joanne. But I don't think it matters, and we don't know for sure anyway. So whatever the reader feels comfortable with.
So what attracted you to her story?
Right, I was thinking about this. I think there are three things really that made me think about writing about her. The obvious one, as you said, we know all about Roger Mortimer and his seizing of power so that he was the most important magnate in England and king in all but name. We know all about Edward II and his removal to imprisonment. And of course, we know about Isabella and her relationship with Roger. And yet Joan is a footnote, absolutely overlooked. And yet, in fact, she came from a family that at the end of the 13th century was perhaps more important and more powerful than the Mortimers were. Her grandfather was in charge of sorting out a marriage for her. Her father was dead by this time. And her grandfather, Geoffrey de Joinville, was keen to make a good marriage for her and had his eye on one of the Marcher lordships, hence the Mortimers. Joan had no brothers, and so the whole question was how much land would she take with her into this marriage? She had two sisters, and the grandfather was concerned that the sisters might marry and that their husbands would therefore make a claim on the de Joinville estates. And so he packed both of them, Beatrice and Maud, off to a very small convent just south of Hereford called Aikenbury. And that's the last we hear about them as far as I know. Whether they took vows, whether they eventually came out but lived lives of solitary contemplation, we don't know. But what it meant was that Joan was the sole heiress. And when her grandfather died, she was also Baroness de Joinville in her own right. The lands that she inherited were vast. Great estates in Ireland, in Wales, in the Welsh Marches, and also because her mother was very well connected as well, Jean de Lusignan, there were vast areas in France too. And so there's no wonder that the Mortimers really looked at this possible marriage with gleaming eyes, you know, and what it would bring to the Mortimer Marcher lords. And so with this in mind, I thought, was she as unimportant as we are led to believe? And I thought that probably the answer is no. And she's simply overshadowed by the tremendous events that happen in England that push her into this shadowy world. And I thought I would like to bring her out of it. So that was the first reason. The second one, of course, is that I live in Mortimer country. And wherever I travel, the Mortimers are there. And sometimes you do feel that they're breathing down your neck, you know, or they're walking battlements. The obvious place is, of course, to find the Mortimers are castles. just further north from where I live, there is Wigmore Castle, very much ruined today, but stands beautifully on an outcrop overlooking the main route as it was between Hereford and Ludlow and Shrewsbury further north. It's in a terrible state. Its future is very much in doubt, but it really is worthwhile climbing up to the ridge to having a look at it. And of course, that was the main Mortimer outpost before Joan married Roger, and he rebuilt it into what was going to be a palace with extensive towers and separate kitchens and everything. So it really would have been a superb place. The other castle, of course, is Ludlow, which was Joan's own castle. That came from the de Jonvilles, which of course is in a much better state of preservation and very dominant to visit there. But again, you can imagine Joan and Roger walking the battlements, perhaps not always in the best friendly frame of mind, but it has a great atmosphere there, and it was the main centre for the Mortimers in the future, for their children and grandchildren. So the castles are wonderful. The battlefields are excellent, with Mortimer's Cross, because of course that was the place where Edward of York, who was later to become Edward IV, won the Battle of Mortimer's Cross against Lancaster. And he is a direct descendant of Roger and Joan. And then the little churches, the ones you drive past and don't give much thought to, and yet they play this tremendous role in their lives. Pembridge is my nearest village, and it was here that Joan and Roger were married in 1301 at the church door. Roger rebuilt the church, typical grandiose style. It's still small, but much larger than it was. And the splendid separate belfry, there often are in this part of the world. And so that's an important church. And further north, there is a little one called Lentwardine. And this is where Roger had built 7 extra chantry chapels with their own priests, just to give prayers in perpetuity for his own family, and this is an important one, for the royal family as well. So these were the days when he was far more connected with them than with the Mortimers. And the final one, which if anybody travels in this area they really should visit, is a little place called Muchmarcle, which is to the east of Ludlow. And in it there is the tomb of Blanche Mortimer, who is perhaps the youngest of the daughters of Roger and Joan. And it's a wonderful tomb carved into the church wall. And the carving is slick and smooth and beautiful, with her veils trailing down over the edge of the tomb in a very artistic way. The interesting thing is that the tomb needed renovation. And when it was renovated 4 years ago, perhaps now, they took it apart and took all the coloured coats of arms and things off. And inside the tomb, Blanche is still lying there, wrapped in leather. And to everyone's shock, usually these tombs are empty, and the bodies are down in a crypt somewhere, or perhaps lost forever. But there is the daughter lying sedately under her tomb. Wow. And so she was put back with great reverence and is still there today. But this sort of thing, it makes me think of that I couldn't not write about the Mortimers. And so I decided I would tackle them with all the problems and difficulties of knowing quite who was doing what in places. And I have to say that because I've written quite a lot about Wars of the Roses and later medieval history, their family connections are very important. Because their great-grandson Edmund married into the royal family, Philippa of Clarence, their offspring, of course, took the royal claim with them. And when Anne Mortimer remained the only Mortimer descendant, she married Richard of Cambridge, and their son, the famous Richard, Duke of York. And that's why he could claim the English throne from both sides, from his mother through Philippa and through his father, going back to the Dukes of York. And so we get Edward IV and Richard III, both of them direct descendants of Roger and Joan. But the other one, and this is the one I wasn't aware of till I started writing about them, Roger and Joan's daughter, Catherine, married into I suppose they would say, the Beauchamp family, Beauchamps, as we might say. And of course, their descendant was Anne Beauchamp, who inherited the whole lot of it and the title, Earl of Warwick, and married Richard Neville. And so their descendants, of course, then the Nevilles. And so Anne Neville became Queen of England and connected up there. And I thought that was some wonderful connections. It shows how intermarried all these families were. But it encouraged me to write about Roger and Joan as well. So lots of reasons why I thought they'd be a good pair.
It also shows how the taint of treason is transitory, doesn't it? I mean, Roger's called, I think Ian Mortimer's book is The Greatest Traitor.
Yes.
And yet his descendants still sit on the throne today.
The connections are very strong. Yes, yes.
Well, there were a few traitors in that lineage, weren't there?
I think so, yes. Yes. The 17th century have a good selection of interesting characters, don't they? Of using power and
I mean, I guess that the Mortimers were pretty central for several hundred years, weren't they, really?
Yes, they were. Yes, without any doubt.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Mortimer country, I mean, I don't live there, but I spent quite a lot of time there when I was researching the Wars of the Roses stuff and Mortimer's Cross and so on. And it's just steeped in the history of the period. Amazing place.
Yes, that's right. And of course, Roger's uncle, another Roger Mortimer of Chirk, he owns the great castle of Chirk just over the border into Wales. So that simply bolstered up their power.
That's a good place to visit as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, now, the marriage between them, obviously, that's the central part of the book in many ways. You've portrayed them as being happy and loving up until the point of his arrest. Do we know that? Is that something that's I won't use the word fact, but is that something that you could be certain of, or is it something you interpreted from the evidence you had?
There is no fact, as you said, but I thought there was enough indication, and since it's historical fiction, to hazard a guess.
Oh yes.
In the early years of their marriage, Roger was campaigning more times than not, certainly up in the Reaver borders, the territory up in Northumberland and so on, and so would be away from home a fair amount of time. When the wars calmed down, he spent far more time at home because he was given authority, more authority in the Marches and in Wales, and also he became King's Lieutenant in Ireland, and that meant that he travelled a great deal. Now, Joan could have been a stay-at-home wife without any problem and simply kept order in Ludlow if that's where she wished to live, or Wigmore. And over the years, of course, they had 12 children, 8 girls and 4 boys, which doesn't prove that the marriage was anything in a relationship except fruitful. They shared a bed.
But it does prove they didn't try to avoid each other.
No, they didn't. No, they didn't find themselves totally beyond the pale, which is interesting since it's Ireland. Sorry, but she travelled with him, and we know that she spent much time in his company, particularly in Ireland at Trim Castle, another huge fortress which she inherited from her grandfather Geoffrey, and they stayed there with Geoffrey during his lifetime, and then after he died, with their own power, some of their children were born there. They spent a lot of time at Dublin, in Dublin Castle, where Roger was based when his power was at its greatest. And we know that they travelled extensively in Wales and up and down the Marches. Now, it seemed to me, if it was merely a matter of tolerating each other, they wouldn't have. There was no need. And yet they chose to do so. And I also thought that because she worked so hard at the end to get the children and the lands instated, perhaps she did have a softer side to her memories of those early days when life was good for them. almost destroyed completely, of course, by Roger. Yeah, I thought there was enough evidence that they liked each other enough to travel and live together.
Yeah, I think I'd agree certainly that it's a big indicator if she actually goes with him, because as you say, she could have got away without going with him on many occasions, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh yes, yes. She'd have been much more comfortable, I'm sure, at Wigmore, or because she had her mother-in-law living there quite often, and they seem to get on well, and so why not just live comfortably there? But she didn't. She travelled with him, and as I said, quite a number of their children were in fact born in Ireland.
Yeah.
So how did you go about learning about Joanne's life after Mortimer abandoned her? Do we have much evidence of how she lived after that?
We know quite a lot, perhaps most, about her life immediately when he was in exile, because Joan was accused of his treason. She was as treasonable as he was. And I suppose Edward II was concerned if any Mortimer supporters decided to support Joan and give her some backing, she might become a centre of rebellion. And so she and the children were kept under strict confinement. At first, Joan and the younger daughters were in a sort of manor house in Hampshire. It's not made clear where, but I presumed it was the sheriff of Hampshire who was in control of them. So it was not strict imprisonment, but it was enough that they were not free to leave. This was while Roger was in the Tower and with the axe hanging over his head. When he escaped and went to France and began to look for support to come back, then it was far more dangerous to have Joan free. And so she was sent off to Skipton Castle. Now, I like Skipton Castle, but it is quite a dark door place to be kept. And she and the young girls were sent there. The amount of money she was given for her upkeep was reduced considerably. Her servants and household, if you like, I think was reduced to 6 people, very, very limited. And she was kept there under very strict regime for, I think it was 3 years in the end. And she must have been thinking, is this it? Is this going to be the life for me and the young girls? Because there was no suggestion that it would be possible for Roger to return. He had no money, he had no troops. Who on earth was going to help him? No one that Joan would be able to see, or that anybody else could, until things changed. The boys, the younger one was kept in Hampshire to begin with, but then they were all sent to Windsor Castle, where they were kept in captivity, perhaps at a better level of captivity than Joan's, but even so, they were not free to lead any rebellion. And so we know that this must have been a very anxious time for her, a very worrying time, and what would happen to her and the girls. The older girls were sent off to very minor convents where they could achieve nothing at all. They would just be left there, and nobody would listen to any cries they made for coming to their aid. After that, it really is piecing together what do we know about what Roger was doing, and just hints of things of what Joan might have been thinking and doing. We know that she returned home and spent time at Wigmore or Ludlow, but what was her life like? They didn't live together anymore. We know that they spent time with visits, usually Roger coming to Ludlow, because of course the girls were all freed, and the boys, they had the girls to marry suitably. And so they couldn't say, right, that's it, we will communicate no more. They had to get together to sort out suitable husbands and suitable marriages. And so we presume that they made the best of things, and Joan had to come to terms with this was the man who had abandoned her and betrayed her. What she thought about it, the phrase, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, comes to mind, in that she had been shamed publicly because Roger and Isabella made no attempt to cover up their relationship. And so she had to make the best of it. I don't think she did it easily, and I don't think she did it willingly. And the one event that really I wrote about and thoroughly enjoyed writing about was the one where Roger arrived in Ludlow to inform her that their two daughters were to be married in Hereford. And then all the guests would come up to Ludlow for a celebration and feasting. And amongst them would be Isabella and also her young son, who would eventually become king, Prince Edward, and his young wife, Philippa of Hainault. And I can imagine what Joan thought about this. You know, this was her castle. It was at de Jonville Castle. And here she was being asked to entertain her husband's paramour in her own suites of rooms and her chambers and her solar. Would she really have to give it all up to Isabella? And because of the outcome, I'd presume she said no, that she wouldn't do it. And I can imagine, I wrote the scene, I did enjoy it, saying, I won't do it. If you wanted to come here, you've got to make your own arrangements. And so Roger, typical, did. He built a separate block onto the castle. And it's a splendid block with a new solar, new chambers, new bed chambers, a new entry into the Great Hall, so that there could be a dais at each end, if that's what his wife Joan was demanding. And added to it, of course, whether this was pure chance, it has a whole set of latrines indoors, a complete loo block inside. Very sophisticated stuff here, you know, nothing like the long drop of old. And that was built too. Visiting Ludlow Castle, they're all there to see. So yes, I imagine she didn't always make it easy for him. But then, of course, by this time, he was powerful and he was rich because he'd returned with Isabel and her forces and her money at his side. And so he simply built a new section to the castle. And that's where we presume the royals stayed. Well, in fact, we know they did, and Isabella too, whereas Joan stayed in her own suite. And we don't know about the feasting, whether they sat at separate ends, but I imagine they did. Now, where Roger spent the night would be interesting to know. If he had any sense, he'd have gone to the great castle keep, which was no longer used very much and kept out of the way of both sets of women. But things like that, where we're given indications of what might happen, it's possible to fill in. And we also know at the end, when Roger had been executed and all their estates and their titles had been stripped from them, of course, as traitors, Joan made it her policy for quite a number of years to pester Edward III, as he was then, to restore it, and that they really didn't deserve the total ignominy of losing everything. And she sent letters, we know. Whether she went to court or not, we're not sure, but I thought that she might have done, so I wrote that in. And by the time that Joan died, she was 71 when she died, an elderly lady, it had all been restored. And her grandsons had inherited the title and they got the lands back and the castles and everything. So she worked hard for it and very effectively. And I thought that showed a certain loyalty to the whole family. And if she'd hated and detested Roger that much, perhaps she'd have just left him to it, you know, to an ignominious death. And the other thing that we don't know about, but I hazarded a guess here, is where Roger was buried. The Mortimers in the past had been buried at Wigmore Abbey, and that's just down in the valley below Wigmore Castle. And it was an important part of their estate, and a lot of their possessions had been kept there, especially their important possessions. And we know that quite a number, a good dozen of the Mortimers were buried there. Joan was, for example, and Roger's father and mother were buried there. They've all gone, of course. The terrible dissolution of the monasteries robbed us of all these tombs with their effigies and brasses and what have you, all gone. And the abbey today, what's left of it is merely the gatehouse to the abbot's lodging. It's a wonderful place. It's not open to the public. Except for special occasions. I have been there on one of these occasions when John Challis lived there. I can't remember what it was. I think it was a local large flower event, and he opened his gardens and house to those who wished to go. But everything else has gone. He did used to say that he thought the Mortimers were still lying under his front lawn, but perhaps that is so. But Joan wanted, as far as we know, wanted Roger to be returned there. Edward III was very reluctant and at the beginning said no. And it was possible that either he was buried with the Greyfriars in Coventry or the Greyfriars in Shrewsbury. And perhaps that was so. But of course, they've all gone as well. So we shan't know. But I just thought it possible that if he was going to give back all the titles and all the land and everything, he might just have relented and let Roger be buried with the rest of the Mortimers in Wigmore Abbey.
I guess one of the hardest things when you're dealing with a subject that you just have these fleeting glimpses of, like Joan, the whole idea of how she felt about his betrayal of her and his relationship with Isabella and so on, that's quite hard to write, isn't it? That kind of confusion maybe in her head and so on, because you're working with so little and yet you want to tell a story of how she is at that point. How did you go about that? Because that seems quite difficult.
It is difficult, yes. And I think to begin with, her anger would have known no bounds. She would have been, and as I said, being held up for public ignominy, even ridicule, if you like, by what Roger and Isabella had done. And so she must have been beyond any forgiveness. But I wondered as the years passed and they had to keep company and they had to work together for the benefit of their daughters. And of course, they lost a son through one of these fevers that attacks everybody in the Middle Ages. It seems nameless. And one in a tournament in Shrewsbury. They must have mourned them together, and perhaps the initial connection was not totally lost. In a sense, it was a case of me thinking, what would I think about this if it were me? And yes, I would be furious and I would never forgive him. But on the other hand, he did do all he could for their children and for her in later life. And sometimes anger, although it doesn't disappear, wanes a little. And I tried to do a balance between the two. And that's why I thought in the end, she might do what she could to bring him home to Wigmore and the Welsh Marchers. Otherwise, she could say, right, fine, you made your bed, lie on it, you were executed for treason. So, let the king have his own way. And I wasn't sure that she would have done. And she seemed to have kept in good relations with all her children and with Roger's mother while she was still alive. There might just have been that element of, if not forgiveness, at least understanding that was how he saw his way to coming home and getting back what was his. But then there is no proof, it's historical fiction, isn't it? And you lay yourself open to those who don't believe it was so. But that's what I thought.
The reason I asked is that you do achieve what I see as a kind of quite a real relationship in those difficult years. So I think you cracked it as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
Because the thing about when you're dealing with two individuals about which something is known but not everything, it is very hard to pitch it right. And I think you did it very well indeed.
Thank you. Yes, I hoped I did. Yes. I didn't think she could be angry forever simply because of the children. And so I hoped that I had a balance.
And that's what happens. That's what happens in life.
Yes, it is.
In families.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I also think we have a tendency to excuse that kind of betrayal in medieval times by saying men were, it was commonly done by men all the time. And just saying, well, she should have accepted it because that's what men do. It was interesting to see your way of, it wasn't the norm. It wasn't accepted. accepted, because I think we tend to colour over it because so many kings had extramarital affairs, but not
No,
all of them
no,
did.
and not so blatantly
So not
either.
everybody
I
did.
think that's
No.
the thing. That
No.
you've got any woman, the blatantness in London and the court and wherever they spent holidays, Christmas and so, at one castle or another, and they were always together. It really must have hurt.
So I know you like Joan. I can tell you like Joan. Do you like Roger?
Now that's a difficult one, isn't it? It is difficult. He was a man of his time. He was a marcher lord, and that means battle and blood and killing, and you have to accept that aspect of it. I can't forgive him, hard to forgive him, the treatment of Joan, and especially when she had to spend the 3 to 4 years locked up for his sake, and then he comes back with a mistress who he stays with, and I don't feel that he was terribly asking for Joan's forgiveness or anything like that. It was done, and therefore she had to accept it. I admire his flamboyance, even though in the end it brought him to his death. One of the scenes I wrote, because I thought it was wonderful, is another double wedding at Wigmore Castle, where we have quite a lot of detail of it, where he held the court of King Arthur, because he always claimed that King Arthur was part of his pedigree. And so it was a splendid 4-day event at Wigmore with tournaments and festivities and gift giving, enormously expensive gifts. And the king and queen, Edward III and Philippa, were there, and all the Mortimer children, as far as we know, and of course Isabella. And I say the flamboyance was tremendous. And who, of course, was King Arthur in King Arthurian robes? It was Roger. He had to play the role. He couldn't not. And who was Guinevere? It had to be Isabella. It couldn't be poor Joan. Joan is never mentioned. I'm sure she was there because 2 of her daughters were getting married, and she wouldn't have bowed out of that. She has too much self-importance of her own worth. But there was Isabella as Guinevere. But the interesting one, I think, was the young King Edward III, who might have expected that he would have been King Arthur, and he wasn't. He was just Sir Lionel, who rode in the tournaments. He took it as a bit of a joke, I think, in the end, that he wasn't the most important person there, and that Roger was. And later in his life, when he loved tournaments, as we know, he often rode in them as Sir Lionel from these days back in Wigmore. I think Roger's family at this stage realised he was playing with fire. And Geoffrey, the son who inherited all the French lands and spent most of his time in France after this, he called him King of Folly, and that this was not the way to do it, and he would pay for this and for just the amount of power that he was wielding, and giving none to the young king, who was growing up by now and was expecting to wield power in his own right. But that was Roger, and you have to admire the self-importance, if you like. He did pay for it, of course. He was executed in the end. So did I like him? Like it? It's difficult, isn't it? No, there was lots that he did that I couldn't admire, but there are some things that I did and enjoyed writing about.
He's one of those characters that actually fascinates, isn't he? Because you see the power he eventually wields. He must have known what was coming.
Yes, I think he did.
But he didn't actually have a way out anyway, did
No.
he? He'd got that high.
It was merely a matter of waiting until Edward III was old enough to take the power and to deal with Roger. I'm sure he knew that the time was coming and that there would be no friendly agreement as to what would happen about him. It will be it will be difficult for him, and probably his death. Yeah.
What do you think about the relationship of Roger with Isabella in terms of what it was based on? Was it based on the fact that Roger was in France seeking help, and here was Isabella who maybe offered that help to get back his position in England? But was there genuine affection between them? How do you categorize their relationship?
Yes, it's another difficult one, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
She was a means to an end, because she was the way he could return and get back his lands and his title, etc. It's difficult to think that she was only that, though, because they remained together for the rest of his life, and until Edward called a halt to it all. They spent, as I said, Christmases together, holidays together. They went to travelled round England to various castles. If there was war in the offing, she travelled with him. It's difficult to imagine that it was simply a means to an end, and that there wasn't some very close, very powerful connection, whether it be love or attraction or whatever you like to call it, between them. The chantries that Roger set up, not just for the Mortimers, but for Isabella as well, and for Edward and Philippa of Hainault. There is the possibility that they had a child born to them, possibly a son who didn't live or didn't live very long. It seems that an 8th chantry was added at Lentwardine, which might have been for this unknown, unnamed child. Was he given the title Earl of Lincoln or something? There wasn't such a person at the time, and it may be that this was a child that Isabella carried for him, in which case they were, very close. And perhaps there was an element of love and not just a basic attraction there. There was nothing she could do to save him, because Edward sent her off to various castles. He didn't treat her badly, but he was not going to listen to anything that would weaken his decision to get rid of Roger Mortimer. So there it is, means to an end to begin with, but their closeness is without doubt. And so perhaps there was love in the end.
You did have me wondering about the child, and I did think, what if there was a child? What if it survived? And what if somebody, they secreted it away somewhere?
Goodness, that would have caused problems, wouldn't it, with Isabella and the Mortimer? Well, yes, but terrible thing to say. Perhaps in the long run, perhaps it was a good thing that the child did not survive.
Yeah, because how would Edward have treated his illegitimate half brother?
Yeah.
It makes you think, though, doesn't it? The possibilities.
Yes, and there were quite a number of illegitimate half brothers, weren't there, in the previous royal family, who were entitled, and they were accepted, and went to war for their royal. So it was possible to do it, but whether the Mortimer shadow would loom too greatly over this child. But yes, would have been interesting.
I think it might well have done, actually.
Definitely.
Yes, I think you might be right.
He was such a huge figure, wasn't he?
Yes,
So
yes,
dominant.
he was, absolutely.
Yeah, especially with Edward only being so young at the time.
Yes.
As an 18-year-old to his half-brother would have been different to Edward as a 30-year-old to a half-brother who he would sympathise with.
That's right.
As an 18-year-old, it would have just been all the hurt and pain that had built up from his mother's treatment of first his father and then him, and the relationship with Roger. It would have been, he probably wouldn't have survived anyway.
It's quite astonishing, isn't it, that he was so determined at such a young age. At 18, he had decided that was it, that was enough, and he would take power.
One question I've just realised that I didn't ask you about. You have Edward II surviving, and we know Ian Mortimer is a great proponent of Edward II's survival, but I've always wondered exactly how he might have survived, and I do like the way you portray it.
Yes.
Because, because Edward III must have been complicit.
He must.
For his father to be able to survive after it had been announced to Edward that his father was dead.
Yes, it's an impossible question, isn't it?
It is.
And it does raise terrible angst on both sides. I mean, Ian Mortimer thinks that he survived, and Catherine Warner, of course, does, and that perhaps was in France and living there in a retired situation. I don't know the answer. But I didn't want to go down the line of, yes, he was dead, and that was the end of it. Because if that was so, there would have been no problem at all about Edward III becoming Edward III and end of all problems. And yet there seems to be this difficulty for him in coming to terms with that past element and keeping Roger Mortimer under control, if you like, and making sure that his own power is secure enough. As I say, if Edward II was dead, then what was the problem? And yet there obviously is that difficulty for the young Edward III, which made me think that perhaps that's the strongest evidence of all, that Edward II was not dead, and that the splendid tomb and ceremony in Gloucester Cathedral was just a mock to cover up what, in fact, Edward III didn't want known.
Well, I've always wondered about the practicalities. They had a funeral. The body was on display before the funeral.
Yes.
And I'd always thought, well, that was to prove that he was dead. So how could they suddenly say he isn't? And you've got this image, this portrayal of him, his body being totally wrapped and his face being covered in a mask.
Yes, that's right. Because that's what happened to them, wasn't it? They were wrapped in leather to secure their body from corruption. So it could have been done. So all those who came to see would see the body and presume, and there would be nothing to indicate whether it was just another body. But yes, the whole thing is difficult. I don't like the Berkeley Castle theories. I think they've been pushed, under the carpet now, totally.
Yeah, certainly the red hot pokers.
Yes.
No longer.
Whether he did live on in France, I don't know. But I did think that Edward III had an interest in this death, if you like, and that perhaps it wasn't as straightforward as we might like to think. I know when I started writing, I thought, an awful lot of things here you don't know the answer to. Are you sure you want to start writing this book? But as I wrote through, the answers that I wanted made me come to terms with some of the questions, not to make them false, but to make them as they seemed to fit what was happening.
In the end, you go with kind of gut feeling about, you look at the evidence, you think about how the character was in other situations, and you kind of go with that in different situations.
Yes, it has to fit, doesn't it? And you can't have somebody doing something that is totally out of character with what you know later on.
Yeah, and I think the way you portrayed Edward II's death or survival certainly makes sense. It's certainly a possibility.
A possibility.
So what are you working on now, Anne?
Right, it is called, I've moved on back to the Wars of the Roses. It's called The Queen and the Countess, and I thought I'd like to look at two of the most important women of the Wars of the Roses who would have known each other and had very similar histories, but in other ways were quite different. One of them is Margaret of Anjou, the Queen, and I thought she deserved a better press than she is often given.
I think we both agree with that.
We have Shakespeare to blame for a lot of it, but not just Shakespeare as well. I think other history has written her as a woman who seizes whatever power she can. She is without compassion, she is without sympathy, she is bloodthirsty, and I thought there must be more to her than that, given her fairly youthful age, when she is left in a marriage with a king who is incapable of making decisions, and she has to do it herself, both for her husband and then, of course, for her young son. And she's given very little choice as to how she deals with so many situations. She cannot trust people because everybody is out for their own interests, and I thought I would like to write about her, not whitewash her to any degree. I mean, I think she is quite a difficult character sometimes, but there is a humanity about her too, and I think I wanted that. And the other one, of course, the Countess, is the Anne Beauchamp, the descendant of the Mortimers, the wife of Warwick the Kingmaker. Now, we know very little in comparison about her, and I thought that it would be interesting to see if there was more to say about her than just the obedient wife who did what Warwick told her and went into exile when they had to and came back when they could and had two daughters and so on. Was she very much under his thumb and had nothing more to say? I decided that she had more to say, that she must have had an awareness of her own importance as the Countess of Warwick in her own right. She seems a very capable character. She certainly runs her own household most efficiently. Yes, she went into exile and came back when she had to, but I think we see her at her best. So it means that you can rewrite bits of the past. When she comes back from the French court on her own because of the storms, she takes refuge in Beaulieu Abbey and looks for being able to return to court, because Warwick will come and collect her, to learn that, of course, her husband was died at the Battle of Barnet. And suddenly she is on her own, and she knows that she'll get no help from Margaret of Anjou at this stage, because the relationship between Margaret and Warwick was never a comfortable one. And so Margaret would never really come to and rescue, what would she do? She had to fight for her own position, for her own lands, for her own income, for all her own rights, and she does it on her own. And I mean, I won't say any more because it spoils the rest of the book in a sense.
Yes.
But both of them end up in a terrible state of being rejected by everybody and being alone and having to cope for themselves. I thought it was an interesting look at the two, how they eventually end up their lives. Do they cope with it? Do they accept what's been done in their name and not in their name at the end? And so that's what I have written, and it will be out next February. It's written from 2 points of view, from Margaret and Anne. They communicate at various times during the book. They write to each other occasionally, although it is not a book totally about letters. It just works its way in. And then at the end, the relationship is drawn together again. So, yes, but it's a two-sided thing. I enjoyed it. I found it difficult. I think perhaps it was the hardest book I've written, to keep them balanced and to keep Anne Beecham with enough to say.
Yeah, it must have been tempting to just concentrate on Margaret because you've got so much information on Margaret, whereas Anne's harder because we haven't got as much on her.
And of course, from Anne's point of view, it's Warwick who dominates.
Yes.
Because so we know what he's doing and why he's doing it. Not an easy one, but one I was satisfied with at the end.
Oh, can't do worse than that, can you? When you finish writing it and you go, yeah, that's done it. So well done. I look forward to reading that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anne, for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I can highly recommend A Court of Betrayal to anyone. I'll defy anyone to actually read it without a tear coming to their eyes at certain stages. And without wanting to punch Roger.
Yeah.
Push him off the battlements. Yes.
Yeah, just a gentle push. Because you do get the impression at points where he just, either he doesn't realise or he doesn't want to realise how much he's hurt Joan.
I think he probably does, but the end justifies the means, because it was all to do with Mortimer power and dominance and his family in the past and what his family would become in the future. So if some people have to be hurt to do that, then it's acceptable.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of medieval history in that.
Yes, Derek and I were only talking. We did an episode on Magna Carta a couple of weeks ago, and we were saying then it's land, land, land. That was the priority for every family. It was all about land and inheritance and passing on to your son more than you'd inherited. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much, Anne. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you this morning.
Thank you for the invitation. I've loved being with you.
And will you come back to talk to us about Margaret of Anjou and Anne Beecham?
Oh, I will, yes.
That'll be fascinating.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you very much to Anne O'Brien. Please do read A Court of Betrayal. You will not be disappointed. Join us next time when we will be chatting with fellow podcaster Luke Daly about his new book, Medieval Saints and Their Sins. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening, and do subscribe to avoid missing a podcast. If you enjoyed it, perhaps give it a like. We'd love to have a rating or a review from you. Join us next time.